Good morning, everybody. I'm David Verrill. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Digital Business, one of your co-hosts for today's event. Thank you again for attending. I'd like to introduce Jason Ponton, the Editor-in-Chief of Technology Review Magazine and the academic keynote panel. Jason?
Thank you, David. This morning, we are going to discuss what every CIO should know about the future impact of digital business. Thank you for coming this morning. Rather than doing what so many moderators do, which is to read out tediously the bios that you already have in your packages, I'm going to ask each one of my panelists to say who they are, where they work, a little bit about their background, and to describe a research project that they're working on right now, which interests them, because that'll provide some context and tell you where they're coming from. So on my immediate left, Eric.
Thanks, Jason. I'm the director of the MIT Center for Digital Business. I'm one of the sponsors of this event, and our work focuses on understanding how digital technologies can transform business and the economy. Right now, I think we're in one of the biggest revolutions, one of the biggest opportunities for CIOs in our lifetime, and that is what I call the nano data revolution and the opportunities around data-driven decision-making and using very, very fine-grained data to understand businesses in a better way. And we have a whole series of research projects around that with different people at Sloan School, and some even with Sandy Pentland here, who I'm sure will give us a chance to talk a little bit more about some of that work as well. Since the beginning of this week, there's been more digital data collected by American businesses than they collected in all of history up to the year 2003, just in the past 2 days. And the rate of growth of this digital data has just been continuing to grow exponentially. Most of it hasn't been used in a very effective way historically. It's collected as byproducts of clickstream, of using the web, or of ERP systems that collect data on operations and customer data, or Google searches and mobile data. But this data can be incredibly valuable. In fact, I would argue that most major revolutions in science and our understanding of the world have been preceded by revolutions in measurement. That's true whether you think 400 years ago when Galileo first saw the rings of Saturn, or 300 years ago when Antony van Leeuwenhoek looked in a drop of water and saw microbes for the first time. I might not be on the podium today, the stage today, if it weren't for our understanding of antibiotics and our ability to understand better the biology of medicine because of our ability to measure things in a more fine-grained way. Today, the revolution in measurement is the one that's affecting managers and economists and policymakers, and it's one that's driven by this ability to measure data in a much more fine-grained way. One of the projects that we did at the Center for Digital Business set out to measure how much of a difference this approach, which we call data-driven decision-making, made in the performance of companies. And what we found was that companies that had adopted a more data-driven approach, which were using these types of data, were about 4 to 6% more productive than their competitors, which were relying primarily on intuition and experience, more traditional ways of making decisions. And I think that in the next few years, we're going to see more and more firms taking advantage of this flood of data, and CIOs, I think, will be at the center of that revolution, making it possible for their senior management and really for people throughout the organization to use data in a more effective way, and it's transforming the way we run companies today.
Thank you, Eric. David.
So I may be here under slightly false colors. The heading of this session is what you should know about digital business, and I only indirectly know about digital business. I work at the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence lab here, and my background, which I've been focused since about 1975 on the architecture of the internet. Obviously, the internet relates to digital business, but that's up to you. My focus at the present time is on the forces that are shaping the future of the internet. One of the areas that's been of tremendous concern, of course, is residential broadband, so a lot of my work has gone into the residential rather than the enterprise component of the internet. Why is it that 22% of the population say they don't use the internet and don't want to? Why is it that we expect internet service providers to continue to invest in get us greater capacity if we're only going to just give them $40 a month no matter what they do. And there's some serious policy issues there. This is not technical research. And in fact, in my lab, I have become somewhat of an outcast because I've hired an economist to work for me. Apologies, but I'm not in the Sloan School. And I recently hired a political scientist, which people think I've taken leave of my senses. The second thing I've been working on is internet security. And I noticed that came up in the previous session a little bit. And all I will say about it right now, if people want to come back to it, we can, is that one of the problems with respect to security is that everybody says they want it, but we have no agreement as to what the word means. And if you push down hard, you'll discover tremendous disagreements lurking under the cover. And again, these are not technical disagreements. These are economic, policy, regulatory disagreements. So this is not a technical problem. This is a socio-technical problem, hence my political scientist. And the third thing I've been working on is to try to understand what's happening in certain industries that seem to have had what I would call a particularly violent collision with the internet. The telephone industry had a violent collision, so did the music industry, and now we see the video industry having a violent collision with the internet. That has obviously a transformative effect on that industry. It's breaking it up into pieces, it's modularizing, it's opening it up. It also has a tremendous impact on the internet. There's some statistics now that during peak hours in the evening, 20%, perhaps now 25% of download traffic comes from Netflix, and that obviously makes the ISPs puzzled as to what to do about it. So I'll leave it with that, and we'll see what we want to come back to in questions.
Thank you. Greg.
Good morning. I'm Greg McRae. I'm a faculty member in chemical engineering here at MIT. And throughout my career, one of the things I've tried to do on a pretty regular basis is to take sabbaticals with industry to get this interchange between academia and university, because we can learn a lot from both sides. And for the last few years, I've been working in New York, and I was given a very interesting task with a blank sheet of paper to say, how do you design the next generation computing environment for financial analysis? And in particular, how to dramatically drive the costs down and the performance up. And this is a project which was also led by another MIT alum, and essentially the blank sheet of paper looked at a whole set of issues which I think affect the future of digital business. One is sort of the technology itself, and there's lots of dramatic developments taking there. Rethinking the software and hardware architecture to support the data-driven decision-making. Rethinking the operation itself and thinking of it much more from a supply chain management problem, and learning from other industries, from outside traditional IT businesses, what can be done to really improve the way in which you deliver resources on time. A lot of work on risk management. How do you provision resources that are needed to support the business in an environment where there's lots of uncertainty about the business itself, and given the very high costs associated with many of the IT infrastructure, how do you actually balance the uncertainties in growth with the provisioning of the resources that you need to meet the goals? Lots of activities associated with organization, which was touched on the first panel. This critical need from the technology to help influence some of the directions in which the business might be able to take advantage of the technology, and more importantly, learning as much as you can from the business to help rethink what the IT technology should be itself. A lot of emphasis in business these days is dealing with environment, and in particular, how do you become carbon neutral? And power consumption is a very important part of IT organizations today. How do you rethink the design of the power and cooling infrastructures to dramatically lower the cost? And lastly, education. How do you bring people into this business, which on the one side, you want people who are very tech savvy, but you also want people who can actually communicate and interact with the businesses to get this two-way benefit of the skills that each group has.
Thank you, Gregor. And last but not least, Alex Sandy Pentland.
Hi. So I work in the media lab, but also with the Sloan School and engineering school. Eric mentioned this revolution in measurement that would lead to data-driven decision-making. And I invent and build the tools that do that measurement, both inside the corporation and outside, looking at consumers. So it's not just web information, but things like mobility data off of phones, call log data, financial data. As you begin to put these together, you get not just data, but you get real insight into what's happening with your consumers. You can do the same thing inside the corporation, looking at social media, looking at face-to-face interactions. And when you do that, we find with company after company that we work with that we get dramatic increases in productivity and also in customer satisfaction. The problem is the thing we heard in the last panel is security, privacy, versus how do you make this data liquid and monetize it. And so for the last 4 years, I've started a project with the World Economic Forum to bring together the CEOs and the regulators and the privacy advocates and the security experts to talk about how can we have increasing big data for these analytics. And remember that this data is personal data. It's data about people, and that's why the regulators are concerned. And how can we get a win-win-win solution? And so over the last several years, we've had regular meetings in Davos and other places. And I think we've come to a place where we understand what the regulators will approve of, what the NGOs and advocacy organizations will approve of, and how you can make money off of this personal data, both by reorganizing and having a data-driven internal organization, but also a better understanding your customers. And the key to it is giving consumers or employees more control over the data that is about them. And in these discussions, we've come up with a general framework for accomplishing this, and we're now building that out and field testing it to get actual reactions, both inside corporations and in field tests.
Thank you, Sandy. So I heard some common themes there. I'm sure you heard them also. Data-driven decision-making, the revolution in measurement, nano data, and we're going to talk about them and address some of the challenges as well that were raised in this morning's panel with security, privacy, who owns the data. But before we do, I think I would like the panelists to maybe sketch the scale of the revolution. How much data are we talking about here, and from whence does it come? Why are we suddenly submerged in a sea of new data that we didn't have 10 years ago?
Well, briefly, I can touch on it. I mean, the units are petabytes, exabytes, which maybe are sort of meaningless to you. Maybe another way to score it is one study we did, and anyone in this room can do fairly easily, is we looked at Google searches. There are over 100 billion Google searches per month. And each of those searches is a window into what people are thinking of doing, not even what they're actually buying, but what they're thinking of buying or thinking of things that they're interested in, sort of by definition. You can match up those Google searches that are available for free from Google at Google Trends, or a little more powerful interfaces at Google Insights for search, and correlate it with things like housing or car sales or your own products. We did this with housing sales, and we were able to substantially outpredict the National Association of Realtors and all their much better economists and experts on real estate, not because we know much about that industry, but just because this vast amount of data is now available for free. Any of you can go and look at it. 100 billion searches a month that you match up to other data series. We did it in a few weeks, and that's a good example of how a very large amount of data is available about people's intentions to do economic activity, or you can match it with other types of social or political or other activities. And from it, you can very quickly build predictive models that are very influential.
So from my perspective, the most important growth is in unstructured data. So it's things like location data that comes off your cell phone, call data, financial transaction data, security cameras, RFIDs. And when we look at those things and add them to the sort of things that Eric talks about, we find you can get things that are just absolutely startling. You can get lifts in terms of predicting cross-selling that are 10 times what you can get over standard sorts of methods. You can predict people's political views with surprising accuracy. We just finished a study where we can predict what app you're going to download on your phone next out of all those thousands of apps with 50-50 odds. So out of 10,000 options, we can tell you the next 2 or 3 that you're going to do, right? That's amazing, right? And that data ends up to being petabytes a day easily, and is going to exabytes. And it's a very different type of data because it is unstructured. You have to handle it very differently. That leads to different architectures for computing, different architectures for communication, and some really different ways in doing analytics. You know, it's a standard thing is, you know, you take a sample of your data and you build an abstract model of it. Well, today, you know, you can have all that model live, or that data live, and rather than building an abstract model, you use the data as the model. That lets you see the black swan events. And in some of the things we've done with financial return, moving from sort of standard Black-Scholes type differential modeling to using the data itself often can give you numbers like 20% increase on return on value.
Please go, yeah.
Just to give a different dimension to the growth of data, if you look across many of the financial institutions, the data is increasing, or storage is increasing roughly at 80% per year compound. And if you look at that number, very quickly it overtakes the power consumption of the actual computers themselves. So there's some very interesting technological opportunities to think about just how to manage the power and the data architecture associated with this flood of information. But to me, one of the most interesting things was a point that Sandy touched on, which is one of the things that's very different with this flood of data is that the algorithms which we've traditionally used for building regression and models just can't cope with this thing. So there's lots of interesting things that you can do with Bayesian statistics and new ways of data mining to basically strip information out of it. So I think that the power piece is a very important part. It's a very dominant part of the operating cost of big data centers now. But how to actually extract the information out in such a way that you can actually help you make a decision. But more importantly, how do you learn from this history to help make better decisions looking forward? And certainly in the financial industry, that's something of great interest, and also being able to detect quickly anomalous events before they actually happen.
I can feel the CIOs shrinking in the audience at the thought of managing this sea of unstructured data. And you touched upon them, but before we get into some of the challenges, for the audience, perhaps the panelists could describe some real-world anecdotes about the benefits to corporations from having access to this kind of data. So there are various famous stories. Greg presumably is in the business of actually describing these benefits to his financial customers. What do I get to do if I'm a CEO with this data that I could not do before? Anyone?
Well, I'll give you two examples, one inside and one outside. So one inside is we went in and we looked at the pattern of communication in a call center for a major financial institution. So it wasn't just the email and electronic communication, but also the pattern of face-to-face and verbal communication. And on the basis of that, we were able to improve their productivity. It's a little hard to say exactly how much, but it adds up to about $15 million per year for the one call center. So that's inside. Just by reorganizing, incidentally, their coffee break structure, which was, it cost them nothing. And on the outside, there have been a number of stories. The one I like best, actually, is we discovered that by looking at mobility data, so this is location data from your cell phone, you could predict likelihood of diabetes and get a lift of about 5 over the background statistics from other sources of information. And of course, that has that's hundreds of billions of dollars that some of the insurers and health care companies can potentially save by knowing which people are at risk for diabetes. And the trick there is that diabetes is a disease of behavior. So people with one type of behavior are at risk, and people with another sort of behavior are at much less risk. Those are the sorts of insights from this unstructured data that are dramatic, I think.
So, Eric, everyone associates this kind of data-driven decision-making with web companies or media companies, but an example that you and I have talked about a lot is the apparently very old-fashioned company Caesars, who has a MIT PhD as its CEO.
That's right.
And does controlled experimentation in real time continuously.
Right. Well, first, I want to underscore the first point you made, which I think we can learn a lot from web and media companies. In many cases, they are on the leading edge. It's just much easier to do experiments online and with digital data. And so often you see the first examples of companies like Amazon doing hundreds of experiments per day to understand their customers better and analyzing that data. But as you correctly note, this is something that every company can do because every company uses data and has digitized their process in different ways. Gary Loveman was a classmate of mine at the MIT PhD program. He got his PhD in economics here. But then he went off to a more illustrious career, and he's now the CEO of Caesars Entertainment, and is nice enough to put me in a nice room out there when I go visit him from time to time for strictly business purposes. And he has completely changed the culture and the organization of that company. It's a good example because when he came there, they actually had, as a byproduct, collected a lot of data. They already had something called a total rewards card. So they knew a lot about their customers, but they really weren't doing anything with it. He described it as showing up and seeing this gleaming F-15 fighter there with no pilot. And I think many companies are in that situation right now where you have a lot of very valuable data that you're not really using. But he inculcated a culture where people would systematically look at the data. And I guess I could tell the story that there are, as he says, there are 3 ways you can get fired at Harrah's. One is we catch you stealing from the company. One is for sexual harassment. And the third way is if we catch you running an experiment without a proper control group. Now, the first 2, maybe have been around for centuries or decades at least. But the third one I think is relatively new. But he does it to stress how important it is to have everyone in the company be thinking in a data-driven way. And the last point I want to make about him is I had him come speak at my class last fall. And the students asked him, well, that's Harrah's or Caesars Entertainment now. But what about the rest of the world? And his view was that there was sort of random set of coincidences that led him to that particular industry. And I should say that Harrah's used to be sort of a third-tier player, and now it's really the biggest and largest successful company in the industry. But he said that, if I had ended up in airlines or banking or consumer products or manufacturing, just about any industry, he would have done the same things, and he seemed quite confident and quite convincing that he probably would have succeeded just as well in any of those other industries. So the opportunity is there, not just in media companies, but I think in every company in the world.
So we've sketched out some of the attractions, and I want to get into the challenges now before we take questions from the audience. David, this data doesn't sound particularly secure. It's pouring in from multiple sources, it's unstructured, it's owned by a variety of people. How are the CIOs in the audience meant to think about the costs and the benefits of making a portion of the data secure, all of it secure, and who's responsible for that security?
Well, I was interested in one of the comments from the earlier panel, which was maybe unless it's data that's specifically about people, where you have very specific requirements which are legally defined, it may be that you don't worry a lot about theft of this data. That it's your analytics, it's your understanding of what you're going to extract from it, as you say. It's the lead time rather than the protection. The risk, of course, is that you get tangled up in a space if it's personally identifying information, if it's health identifying information, or health-related information, you have very specific obligations. I don't worry, in fact, about the data as it is being carried around. We do a pretty good job. Because the internet doesn't transform the data, right? So what comes out the other side is the same as what you put in, then you can encrypt it, that works. It's when you have to mess with it that you have to sort of keep it in the clear. And the thieves today aren't going after the internet, they're using the internet to go after servers, right? Because if you spy on the internet, you can steal something one at a time, but if you can crack a server, you get 100 million in one throw. So clearly, it's in some sense a classic problem. The internet has provided a new vector for people to come in and do the same thing they always wanted to do, which is to break into your server. But part of the problem we have in this space is that we don't have good risk models. We don't have good models to understand the downside of various kinds of breaches. And so it's actually very hard. And I think most people in the industry would say, yes, we don't have a handle on this. it's really hard to think about this as a risk mitigation situation because you can't figure out where to spend your next buck because you don't really understand what the risk is. And the thieves are very creative. And so if somebody says, your job is to keep all of the hurdles they have to jump exactly the same height, I don't have an answer. It's a really tough problem. And all of my security friends say, yeah, really tough problem. Yeah. So I wish I had more sanguine advice there.
So the way some of my friends are thinking about it is trying to move beyond a, it's secret, it's been broken out model to one where you look at it from a purely economic point of view. So you're trying to compute the damage that particular bits of information will do, and then ask how can you move the liability and the risk out of your shop into somebody else's shop. Okay. Well, no, seriously. And so an example of somebody who might be willing to tolerate that risk is the individual themselves, right, if you compensate them adequately. And that's something that regulators will approve. So basically, you're saying, look, here's something we would like to help you do, but it has this risk, and we'll give you this benefit. Do you approve of that? And if you can do that in an informed consent sort of way, then you can begin a financial transaction, a contractual relationship that helps move the risk and the liability around.
In the financial industry, much of the data is publicly available. The real security issue is what you do with the data and the advice and conclusions that you convey to your clients. Pretty much everybody can get access to all the tick data from all of the stock exchanges around the world. That's the easy part. The hard part is what do you actually do with that information and how you protect that to give you a competitive advantage. I mean, a simple example is the program trading, where you're looking for short-term arbitrage opportunities, where you have to bring very high-speed computers, very high-speed networks. But it's the decisions that you're making about the data that's really economic value, not the data itself. So I think it's important to think about what's done with the data, what's processed with the data, and the technologies that you do use to analyze the data. That, in many cases, is infinitely more valuable than the data itself.
David? I was just very quickly going to respond to something Sandy said when you mentioned laying off the liability onto somebody else. Is at the other end of the extreme from bargaining with the consumer or the individual, which I completely agree. I think there's some knotty problems that still have to be sorted out about liability when we go to the cloud. And I think that if you are a small-time user of the cloud, if you just want to use Amazon storage or something like that, and you read their terms of service, basically what it says is, you're welcome to use our cloud. If we screw up, don't sue us. We take no liability. It's your responsibility. And I'm waiting for that one to get debugged, because if you're a CIO, there's actually a tough decision. You are held accountable for not only the theft, but the stability of that information. And when what bargain do you enter into with somebody where all you have is a service level agreement or a contract? You probably don't go inside the data center very often and see how it's being maintained. And I'm waiting for the following horrible scenario, which is somebody breaks into a data center and steals physical disks.
That happens.
Yes, I'm sure it happens. And the data center operator comes back and says, well, we've had a theft of physical disks, but we don't know quite what was on them, so you may or may not have had a data breach.
Yeah.
Which may or may not have involved any of your personal, your disclose, your obligation to disclose. And we really can't tell you because it's a cloud, and so we don't quite know what was where, and so we don't quite know what got stolen.
There is a different dimension to the cloud computing model. Is because of the very large volumes of data that you might want to ship to wherever the cloud is. Often the cost of just transporting that data is way big compared to the economic benefits that you get from having a computing resource. So it's the volume has many different impacts on how you think about using the resources.
This conversation about security has raised two important and interrelated challenges, which are those of the privacy concerns, the justifiable expectation of users that their data be used appropriately, and the issue of who owns the data. So is it the companies collecting and transmitting that own the data, or to the individuals whose behavior is generating the data in the first place. So if we could get into it, gentlemen. So Eric, let's talk about privacy first.
Yeah, let me weigh in on that. I mean, this is one of the many places where technology is way, way ahead of policy, and frankly, even of our understanding of what the policy should be. Each summer, Hal Varian, who's the chief economist at Google, and Susan Athey, who's chief economist at Microsoft, and I run a summer workshop. And one of the most interesting papers at the last one was by a Sloan colleague of mine, Catherine Tucker, which looked at this question of privacy policy and really underscored the importance of these unintended consequences. Now, it's rare that you have controlled experiments in policy, but it turned out that the European Union actually implemented a set of privacy regulations that created a pretty good natural experiment. It was rolled out in different countries in the European Union at different times, and it was very, very restrictive about what companies could track and know about their customers, and particularly when it came to serving online ads. What she and her co-authors found was that once the policy was rolled out, the online ads became dramatically less effective because they were not as targeted anymore, less than 50% as effective as they were before. And so the immediate effect was that the media companies lost a lot of money, and these were companies who were already, we all know, are struggling we're wondering where the revenue is going to come to create content, as Technology Review and other companies are succeeding in different ways. But another response was that those companies responded by having just a lot more ads, so the sites became much more cluttered, a lot more intrusive ads. They tend to have a lot more
the user experience.
Yeah, pop-up ads, these interstitials and so forth. And the net was that it seemed that by just about every measure they looked at, the consumers were significantly worse off. Now, I know they had the best of intentions when implementing these regulations, but it's clear that you need to find some way of balancing those. And what you alluded to, or you mentioned, was maybe if the consumers had some ownership rights and we had a regime where consumers could opt in and opt out or sell or trade their information and say, okay, I'm willing to give up this in exchange for better targeting, but I don't want you to know about that. It's an infrastructure we don't have yet, but I think we're beginning to see the outlines of how it might work.
And that's exactly the discussion that Davos is that everybody sees that the regulators are pushing them into this untenable position where you have to maintain only the minimal information about your consumers, or your internal, actually, for that matter, but your consumers. And so what can you do about it? Well, the thing that you can do is you can give control of that data to the consumer and ask them to opt in. And there are architectures for doing that people have tried on, the hundreds of thousands person scale that seem to work pretty well. There's some good arguments that this can really scale globally. But what needs to happen now is we need to actually build some of these out and actually explore what do people do with it, what are the dangers associated with it, because we don't know the exploits associated with that.
But while it makes sense that consumers should surrender elements of their privacy for clearly defined benefits, the real-world experiments so far have been inconclusive. How many people in the audience understand Facebook's privacy? Right? I mean, so they made a very clear bargain with their consumers. Here's what we're collecting. What would you like to give up? I don't understand it. Are the people who do it well, Sandy?
You need to differentiate between sort of the mess that we see in certain parts of the internet, where people got up and going before they thought through these issues, and the coming sort of really Armageddon, which is when all the heavily regulated industries begin to try to do the same things in terms of moving to the cloud, being social media. So what happens when banks and mobile telephones and medical data all goes in the direction of Facebook? But we better think about the privacy and ownership questions there before that happens. And then maybe we can go back to Facebook and help them get their act in order.
Sandy, can you give us an example of a company that has created these differentiated hierarchies of privacy in an effective and transparent way? So who does it well?
Nobody really does it. I could give you an amusing example.
Sure.
This is a very simple example. So this is a carrier that wanted to have targeted ads for its telephone company, for its telephone customers. And it's prohibited from doing that. And so what they did is they created a cloud storage and web pages for all of their clients, all their customers, where you got information about who calls you, and you could assign them ringback tones. So ringback tones are what you hear when you call, right? Instead of just beep, 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 it would be a jingle for Coca-Cola or something like that. And if you chose to do that, and customers loved it, you'd make €5 a month. But the advertising revenue that the carrier got was on the same order of magnitude as television advertising in the same population. So it was huge, right? Because it's very sticky exposures with recommendations from personal friends or people you talk to. And so there's data that they couldn't normally have touched, advertising that revenue that they couldn't have gotten, but by giving control of that to the consumer, they were able to have that new revenue stream.
It's clear that one thing that doesn't work right now is multi-page privacy statements.
Yeah.
And you know, there's actually an interesting book on this subject by an ethicist at NYU named Helen Nissenbaum. She's written about privacy and context, and she made the point that in a lot of offline situations, we come in with a sort of a normative expectation from the context as what kind of privacy we expect. If you're in a commercial transaction, if you're in a library, if you're in a medical facility, you have certain expectations. And so the privacy contract doesn't have to spell out all the terms. But if you have this bizarre idea that online is a unique and distinct place, then there are no norms, which is a completely broken conception of what ought to be going on. So the contract or the privacy statement has to spell out everything. And so if you put all the details in, then it's 50 pages long and you can't understand it. But if you leave the details out, then it becomes meaningless because it's the details that actually tell you what's going to happen around the edges. It's the details of what's happening in Facebook that actually matter. But if it was functioning within a larger normative set of expectations, and that will happen over time, but we could encourage it to happen.
There are cynics, David, who suspect that those privacy statements are designed to be opaque, so that no one will read them. Yeah.
Well, I think one of the real challenges, though, is education about what the real risks associated with data security really are. I mean, I would guess pretty much everybody in the audience has handed over their credit card in a restaurant, and it's gone out the back and it comes back. That's a risk in terms of somebody stealing. My sense from talking to a very large group of people that talk about these issues is that the general public does not have a good sense of what the real risks associated with privacy are.
So I'm going to take questions from the audience in just a moment, so please prepare them. But before I do, quickly, who owns this data? So just in a couple of words. Sandy, who owns the data?
Well, if you talk to the regulators, companies own the minimum data they need to operate, and they can own aggregate anonymous models that are built off of data that passes through them, but that's it. And one of the ideas is to give consumers access to all of the data that was collected about them, so they own that copy, but then you can then monetize it without running afoul of the regulators.
Should such data be portable? Should I be able to go and take data that I've created at one company and take it to another?
So if I have all of the data that anybody creates about me, that creates a new asset class, which is in fact portable, right? And you'll get companies that come up to help you with portability. You'll get companies that come up to defend your choices so that you make good choices in doing things and so forth. So the idea here is to create a data market, a new asset class in personal data that has far more control by the individual. And they own that part, but that's a copy of what the company...
And this could be the most important thing, the most valuable asset we have as individuals.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I'm going to take questions from the audience. We have 15 minutes. Please say who you are and where you come from. Is the mic working?
I'm Sorin Favisho, EMC, and I'm the second panel with discussing a lot of things around security, and I'm pretty worried. I'm a member in ITF, and I didn't see that we protect ourselves yet. So the question is, what would be because everybody is putting the businesses on the internet as a platform. You can develop on Facebook applications if you want and things like this. So the question is, what do we do? Because what happened lately is a very, very, and it happened to EMC, but doesn't matter. It's a global thing.
Well, I think there's no doubt that in the next few years, there's going to be a catastrophic security breach that's going to get everybody to wake up and take this more seriously than they are now.
And do you believe until there's a Pearl Harbor, Eric, no one will take it security? No one takes security seriously?
You know, that seems to be the way things work in my experience, not just in security, but in just about every...
human nature.
In human nature. And right now, if you look at any of the security processes in any major company, or that most of us as consumers, you know, it's just scary how easy it is to do tremendously terrible things. So what will happen is there's going to be a catastrophe or multiple ones, and then companies are going to invest much more heavily. It's going to be costly and maybe perhaps overreactions in different ways, but that's the way I see things playing out over the next few years.
So there are several companies and also the Defense Department that make a very high priority of data auditing. So putting in place protocols, not things that you have to do, they just happen, where you can know that this piece of data came from this, through that node, was touched by this, and so forth, which, you know, it looks like it might be practical. It scares me because I think about the explosion of data, but it's thought that that may be the only way to begin to address some of these things, to have intrinsic encrypted auditing all the way back.
Which brings also the analytics thing, because how do you cope with that?
Exactly. Yeah, no, it's a whole can of worms.
Well, there is, the good news is that it's really an arms race. On one hand, there's this tremendous explosion of vulnerabilities, but there's also a tremendous explosion of opportunities to trace it. My colleague Andrew McAfee has been working with Nano data to look at security, and you can detect things that you never could have detected before when you start looking at patterns across multiple users, multiple companies. So there are new weapons on both sides.
And there's an interesting trend that you probably know about called homomorphic encryption, largely being led by a gentleman called Craig Gentry at IBM, which offers some possibility of manipulating encrypted data in the cloud. This gentleman here.
I'm Ravi Warren, CIO at Air Liquide. Just a very pragmatic question. We're talking about petabytes and exabytes of data and nano data, and we're beginning to border on complexity theory. You know, what about noise in the data? How can we? Could you speak a little bit to making things simpler, like faculty at my institution, the Wharton School, Peter Fader, for instance, where he says you actually could make bad decisions when you have too much nano data. How do you filter it and do very simple, pragmatic things that are still extremely useful?
Let me just briefly point out that Peter Fader was an MIT Sloan PhD graduate.
It's very important for us here to go and get the MIT plugged in.
One of the things that's just, I think, very interesting now that you've got relatively cheap storage is to think about not just storing the data itself, but attaching into it some sense of what you think the uncertainty in the data is. And that information is what you need to basically improve your decision making and assess the risks if that information is used in the calculations. So it's not just storing the data itself, it's beginning to think about what extra information you need to store to characterize the uncertainty or the source of the data or its provenance. And it's really related to the question before that if you start with the premise that A, you are going to be subject to cyber attack, B, you're going to have disks go bye-bye, you're going to have servers go by, it forces you to think about the whole software environment in a much more fault-tolerant way and to be able to give an attack, to be able to quickly switch to a backup system and be able to detect that a fault is actually happening. So encrypting and adding extra information to the data is a way, in fact, of capturing those things.
I would say also it's particularly important with unstructured data. I mean, unstructured data is typically noisy coming in, and to be able to combine it with anything, you have to have a sense of the uncertainty and the covariance between these things. Otherwise, you quickly reach silly conclusions.
David? I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that people who do data-driven science have known for a long time that all data sets are crap. And they're full of noise, they're full of bad variables. Oh, that sensor was out of whack for the last 5 years. No. And And people who naively believe their data as opposed to staring at it hard often make bad mistakes, and this is not unique to business, this is true of science as well. So there is a kind of you have to view your data with skepticism. On the other hand, it's what you've got.
Yeah.
And I think there's a mindset that comes out of actually the way good science thinks about data that can be carried over.
We take a contrary view, which is that certainly there's a lot of noise, a lot of very bad data being collected, but I think more and more my impression is that the signal-to-noise ratio is getting much, much better. When I first started doing statistics, if you could get a signal that was twice as big as the noise, a t-statistic of 2, that was a publishable paper. Now, routinely, we get t-statistics of like 200. That means that we have a signal that's 200 times or more as precise as and as strong as the background noise. The problem, I think, is becoming less and less being able to find significant results and more asking the right questions. What is it that we care about, and which of these are important and which are not important? And that's a different kind of a skill set than the previous skill set, which really often involved torturing the data so you could learn something through all the noise that was in the data.
But uncertainty is not the issue. The issue is what's controlling the outcome in your decision making. And one of the really exciting things that's happening is that now, having floods of data, is that you can actually begin to develop algorithms which can identify, given all of the possible sources of uncertainty that might affect your decision, which are the ones that are having the biggest impact on the outcome. And it tells you where you might allocate your resources, either to improve the data or to collect more information.
Please.
Hi, Dan Woods, columnist at Forbes.com. I have a question that falls under the umbrella of Professor Eric von Hippel's User-Driven Innovation. It seems to me the complexity of the tools and the complexity of the data mean that the only way to get that magic collection of understanding of tools and requirements that Professor von Hippel seeks when he tries to spur user-driven innovation is to take technologists and who are trained in the tools, who have intimacy or the potential for intimacy with the data, and then train them in the requirements, the questions that the businesses are going to need to answer. But it seems to me when you see most programs for data analysis of big data, you always have the role of the business analyst, and then you have that gap between the business analyst and the tools. Wouldn't people be better off if they just took a bunch of CS grads, trained them in data analysis, trained them in the tools, put them in the businesses, and then had that be the way that big data became meaningful for companies?
That's what Wall Street did.
But I think you're hitting on a really key, important point, which and it follows on my previous point about the difficulty now is asking the right questions. And to do that, it's not enough to just understand the data, and it's not enough to understand the business without the analytics. It's that intersection of people who know enough about the business problems that they can formulate the questions correctly, but also have the skills to be able to put them in a data-driven analysis. That's a relatively rare skill set, and CIOs can be the ones who are on the forefront of that intersection. But it's not going to be enough to have either one set of skills or the other. Either of them alone, I think, will not get you the answers you need.
So one thing I sort of point out, and this will sound arcane, but I think it's not at all, is that, for instance, in the last decade or so, Wall Street hired a lot of CS people and physics people. That sort of math that is applied there is different than the sort that you need for unstructured data. And so we've done a number of things. We've spun off companies in this area. It's the EE guys that deal with noisy signals and that sort of math. It has to do with signal processing that seems to be the part that's going to have the biggest bang for a buck, I would wager.
Information theory math rather than physics math.
Right, yeah. And that's not something that's been done a lot, but I think absolutely you got to take those guys and teach them about the business and get them involved in trying to understand what's going on.
But the issue is about what decisions that you have to make in your business, how much information you need to make the decision, what are the risks associated with that decision, and where you should go to. So I don't think of it so much in terms of questions that you're asking of the data, but what decisions that you have to make based on the data itself. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some very interesting developments in mathematics that can help in that area. But I've seen over and over again people produce very large reports, and then you ask the question, well, what are you going to do with this? And as an engineer, I very much like working problems backwards. What decisions do you have to make? Do you put this position on or off? What information do I need to do? So basically being able to sort of trace out the path between the decision that you have to make, the information that you need to make that decision, and the quality of that information in that decision-making process. And even you can have cases where you can have a perfect decision process, but just a bad outcome.
David?
No, I wasn't trying to get worried.
Hi, my name is Amit. I'm from Putnam Investors. My question is about the exabytes of data that is publicly available now, and all the software that is actually sucking in the data, trying to make the decision on what to do with it. And if all these maybe 5 years from now, when the softwares become more mature and they are able to make the decisions that are supposed to be right, what do you think? Why all these systems will not make the same decision all over the place? Hundreds of them. And we have seen some of that in the financial markets, flash crashes and things like that. Why do you think, what is going to prevent that decision to be not, contradictory, somebody else making an opposite choice than every software that is looking at the same public data and, making the same decisions?
So what you just said is that personal data, private data, is becoming increasingly valuable as a way to differentiate. Yes. If everybody can get at the public data and has already done that, then it's the data that isn't public that becomes the most valuable. And that, I think, is the way of the future.
No, but
I also think you're saying that it's not the data, but it's the way you choose to analyze it, and it's the analytics you apply. And what may be your most secret sauce as a company is not the fact that you can suck this data in, but that you have unique insights about how to extract decision value from it.
Absolutely.
Just the algorithms and the analytics that are the value?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, but also new data sources. I mean, if I have non-public data sources, there are things I can do that nobody else can do, potentially.
You had a follow-up, I'm sorry.
So, what I was trying to say was that this data, the more information that is available now, is, coming to a point where the critical decisions are going to be made by that data, and the private information that you have is kind of shrinking.
Well, I think your point that there is increasing vulnerabilities. We saw on Wall Street some of the things that went awry when companies were all making similar decisions and applying algorithms without a lot of management. But it's happening in more and more businesses. There was recently a book that was selling on Amazon for $2.5 million, not because it was such a valuable book, but because two different resellers had set their algorithms to do the pricing in such a way, I won't go into the details, but over a period of a few weeks, they just kept increasing the price without really having any reality check on it. Unfortunately, I think we're going to have more and more instances where not just on Wall Street, but in the rest of the economy, people will rely on data. They'll write an algorithm that looks sensible to the manager and the programmer, and they'll put it into the open world, and someone else's algorithm will interact with it in an unexpected way, and we will become more and more vulnerable.
I think a really crucial issue is transparent access to data, to be able to look at the data easily and have lots of eyes look at the data, especially in the case of Wall Street.
So on the Twitter back channel, most of your concerns have revolved around the scale of the challenge in securing the data and extracting a meaning from such unstructured data. And I wish I could take some of the questions on Twitter, but I'm going to take one last question, because David has said we only have time for one more from this gentleman who's been so patient.
My name's Rob Palatnik from Depository Trust and Clearing Corp. And my question concerns trying to reconcile global corporations, global data, and sovereign regulations associated with privacy, where each country has its own rules, and you're trying to collect the data and get some meaningful information out of it.
Global information, but a sovereign set of laws.
So one of the interesting aspects of the conversation at Davos is, what happens if you have something in a country and then you get a rogue ruler, right, like Gaddafi or something like that. We believe there are technical solutions to this, and the model is the offshore banking system. The offshore banking system is something all state actors would love to be able to get at, but it's been very resistant. And we can talk about the architecture of that, but it's a very specific architecture that you can imagine designing cloud services around.
You're suggesting an offshore data bank, universally owned by the race, which would...
Well, I mean, let me just suggest that you put a bunch of servers in Iceland and Antigua and Vanuatu, and that any data set doesn't live any one place. It's all RAID, it's all onioned around. So it's not in any jurisdiction. You can't go to any one place and get the data. Yeah. And you have to have the rest of the system be distributed too. So you have to have certifying authorities that are distributed. You have to have other sort of things that are distributed. But at least that is a sort of a whiteboard type of a thing. It's actually possible, it looks like it's possible to build things that are extra jurisdictional.
I thought David already built that and was called the internet.
Well, some of the internet dreamers somehow thought it was going to be extra jurisdictional, and it's become quite clear that that was a nonsensical view. And I think that I'm not entirely sure I'm as optimistic as you are about offshoring the stuff to Iceland. But right? To me, the thing we need to solve is not the multiplicity of jurisdictions. And aligning the policies would certainly be helpful. The first thing we have to do is to get clarity about under what circumstances the jurisdictional rules are clear. The worst thing is to have data where 7 people with conflicting rules assert that they have standing to regulate you. And so I once challenged a US government person by saying, look, there's a lot of cloud in the United States. We actually are very good at building cloud in the United States, but other countries worry about our jurisdiction over their data. Could you imagine taking a region of a cloud data center in Oregon and drawing a line around it and saying, this is in France?
David is hovering behind me, as you can see. We have just gone over time. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank the panel. They were great. Thank you. Thank you.